In the quiet darkness of ancient Earth's forgotten oceans, there exists a creature so alien, so structurally unplaceable in the grand tree of life, that even modern science hesitates when asked a simple question. What exactly was the Tully Monster? Imagine a world more than 300 million years ago, long before dinosaurs dominated land, when shallow seas covered what is now Illinois. And in those murky, oxygen-poor waters something drifted that should not have been able to exist in any familiar evolutionary category, a soft-bodied enigma preserved only by rare geological coincidence in the Mazon Creek fossil beds, its form so strange that when it was first discovered in 1958 by amateur fossil collector Francis Tully, even seasoned paleontologists struggled to classify it, because it did not behave like a fish, it did not resemble an arthropod, and it refused every neat biological label we tried to force upon it. And yet it was undeniably real, preserved in ironstone concretions like a ghost pressed into stone, showing a long, segmented body, a rigid bar-like structure running through its center, and most disturbingly of all, a long proboscis ending in what appeared to be a claw-like mouth, almost weaponized, almost intentional in its design, as if evolution itself had experimented and then abandoned the blueprint halfway through, leaving behind a biological contradiction that still echoes through scientific debate today. And as we zoom into this ancient world reconstructed from fossils and chemical traces, we begin to understand that the Tully Monster is not just a curiosity, but a direct challenge to how we understand classification, evolution, and even the predictability of life itself, because every feature it possesses seems to blur boundaries rather than define them. And in doing so, it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The history of life is not a clean branching tree, but a chaotic experiment filled with dead ends, hybrid forms, and creatures that seem to resist explanation entirely. And nowhere is this more evident than in that anope of Tully Monstrum gregarium, a name that itself feels almost dismissive, common Tully Monster, as if labeling it ordinary could somehow make it less disturbing, because its body lacks the rigid skeletons we associate with vertebrates, and yet it possesses internal structures that some researchers interpret as a notochord-like support rod, a feature that hints at distant relation to early vertebrate lineages, while others argue it aligns more closely with invertebrate groups, perhaps mollusks or annelid worms, though none of these comparisons ever fully satisfy the evidence, and the deeper we go into its preserved anatomy, because at the front of its body sits a long, flexible proboscis that can extend outward like a living tool, ending in a toothed or clawed structure that suggests predation, not passive feeding, implying a level of behavioral complexity that raises further questions about its ecological role, while its eyes, mounted on stiff stalks extending from either side of its head, giving it a visual range that would have been highly unusual in most soft-bodied marine organisms of its time. And these eyes themselves contain pigment structures that some studies argue resemble vertebrate-style camera eyes, not compound insect eyes, adding yet another layer of ambiguity to its classification. And as paleontologists have returned to Mazon Creek fossils over decades, applying increasingly sophisticated imaging techniques, chemical analysis, the Tully Monster has refused to settle into any single evolutionary category, instead shifting like a scientific phantom depending on which features are emphasized. And this instability has made it one of the most controversial fossils in paleontology, because in 2016 a major study proposed that it may in fact be a primitive vertebrate, possibly related to lampreys, based on interpretations of its teeth-like structures and internal anatomy, suggesting it might sit closer to the early evolution of backboned animals than previously believed, while opposing researchers continue to argue that these interpretations are misreadings of preservation artifacts, pointing out that soft-bodied fossilization can distort structures in ways that mimic vertebrate features, meaning what we see may not be what originally existed. And this scientific disagreement is not just about one creature, but about the limits of interpreting deep time itself, because the Tully Monster exists at the intersection of evidence and uncertainty, where every fossil is both a message and a distortion. And as we reconstruct its environment, we begin to see a strange coastal ecosystem of brackish lagoons, oxygen-poor waters, drifting organic debris, and a diversity of soft-bodied organisms that rarely fossilize, suggesting that what we know from the fossil record is only a fraction of what actually lived. Tully Monstrum may have been an active predator or scavenger, using its extendable proboscis to probe sediment or capture small prey, its body likely undulating through water with minimal rigidity, relying on muscular motion rather than skeletal support. And yet even this ecological interpretation remains speculative, because no modern organism behaves exactly like it, leaving us with analogies. And what makes this creature even more compelling is not just its anatomy, but the philosophical rupture it creates in evolutionary biology. Because if we cannot confidently place it within known groups, what does that say about the completeness of our biological categories? And as we continue to study it through CT scans and fossil chemistry, we are not just learning about a strange ancient animal, we are confronting the possibility that evolution has produced forms that sit outside our conceptual frameworks. Creatures that are not missing links, but rather branches that grew in directions we no longer recognize. And in the shadow of this uncertainty, the Tully Monster becomes more than a fossil. It becomes a question mark embedded in stone, waiting for science to catch up. And yet, even as we uncover more data, the mystery only deepens, because every new interpretation seems to solve one aspect while complicating another, leaving us suspended between competing realities of what this creature might have been. And as we reach the edge of current understanding, we are left standing in the dark waters of prehistory, staring into a form that looks back without ever truly revealing itself, as if evolution once tried something so unusual that even time itself struggled to remember it clearly. And in that tension between knowledge and ambiguity, but as an unresolved echo from Earth's deep past, reminding us that the history of life is still full of gaps that no amount of science can fully close. And if Part 1 revealed the Tully Monster as an evolutionary enigma frozen in stone, then what follows is where the mystery deepens into something almost uncomfortable, because now we stop treating it as a curiosity and start treating it as a living system that once had to survive, hunt, reproduce, and navigate a world that no longer exists. And in doing so, we are forced to ask a far more unsettling question. What kind of biology produces something like this in the first place? Because every attempt to reconstruct its body plan leads us into contradictions that refuse to resolve cleanly, starting with its most iconic feature, that elongated proboscis tipped with what appears to be a grasping structure. Not like the jaws of a fish or the mandibles of an arthropod, but something more flexible, more exploratory, almost like a biological probe designed to interact with the environment in multiple ways, suggesting a feeding strategy that may have involved probing soft sediment, capturing small soft-bodied prey, or even scavenging organic material drifting in the oxygen-poor waters of the Carboniferous coastal seas, where decay was constant and life existed in a delicate balance between scarcity and opportunity. And this alone already sets the Tully Monster apart from most contemporaries, because it seems adapted not for speed or brute force, but for precision in a murky world where visibility was low and chemical sensing may have been more important than sight. And speaking of sight, its eyes remain one of the most debated features in paleontology, because mounted on rigid stalks extending laterally from its head region, they suggest a wide field of vision, possibly allowing it to detect movement in multiple directions simultaneously, lens-like regions that some researchers interpret as complex visual organs comparable in organization to vertebrate eyes, while others caution that mineral replacement during fossilization can produce deceptive structures that only resemble biological features, meaning the Tully Monster's vision system may be either surprisingly advanced or fundamentally misunderstood. And this uncertainty extends deeper into its internal anatomy. Segmented body contains a rod-like structure that some interpret as a notochord, a primitive backbone precursor found in early vertebrates, which if true would dramatically shift Tully Monster into the early lineage of backboned animals, placing it unexpectedly close to modern lampreys or hagfish-like ancestors. Yet alternative interpretations suggest this structure could simply be a stiffened digestive tract or a preservation artifact created by compression over millions of years. And this duality between vertebrate and invertebrate interpretations is not just a technical debate, it is a conceptual fracture point in paleontology, because it exposes how dependent our classifications are on incomplete data, and how easily evolution's experiments can slip through the cracks of categorization. And when we examine the fossil record of the Mazon Creek ecosystem, difficult to place, because this ancient environment was a low-oxygen, delta-influenced marine system, where soft-bodied organisms were rapidly buried in fine sediment, creating rare ironstone concretions that preserve delicate anatomical details, meaning this site captures an unusually diverse range of life forms that do not always fit neatly into modern taxonomic groups. And within this chaotic biodiversity, the Tully Monster may have been one of many experimental body plans that flourished briefly before disappearing entirely, leaving no direct descendants and no clear evolutionary trace except these scattered fossils. And this possibility changes how we interpret its strangeness, because instead of seeing it as an anomaly, we begin to see it as part of a broader pattern of evolutionary experimentation during the Carboniferous period, a time when life was still exploring structural possibilities that would later be refined, standardized, or eliminated through extinction. And in this sense, the Tully Monster becomes a snapshot of evolutionary freedom before biological design constraints narrowed the possibilities of body architecture. And yet, even within this framework, its exact ecological role remains elusive, because no modern analog perfectly matches its combination of features. Although some researchers have compared aspects of its feeding apparatus to parasitic or predatory behaviors seen in modern jawless fish, while others suggest it may have been more worm-like, gliding through sediment in search of organic material, and the truth may be that it occupied a niche that no longer exists, one that modern ecosystems have completely erased, making direct comparison impossible. And this leads to one of the most fascinating aspects of its biology, the way it forces scientists to confront the limits of analogical reasoning in evolutionary reconstruction, because we often rely on modern organisms to interpret ancient ones. But the Tully Monster resists this method by combining traits that span multiple modern groups, creating a biological mosaic that breaks the rules of comparative anatomy. And as technology has advanced, from electron microscopy to synchrotron imaging and geochemical mapping, each new layer of analysis has revealed additional complexity rather than clarity, reinforcing the idea that this creature is not simply misunderstood due to lack of data, but may fundamentally challenge the boundaries of how we define major animal groups. And this has sparked ongoing debate in evolutionary biology about whether classification systems themselves are sufficient to capture the true diversity of life's history, especially when faced with organisms that may represent extinct branches with no living equivalents. And as we imagine the Tully Monster moving through its ancient environment, we are forced to reconstruct not just its body, but its behavior, envisioning it navigating dim waters using sensory cues we can only infer, extending its proboscis into sediment like a living instrument, reacting to chemical signals, and participating in an ecosystem where survival depended on adaptability rather than specialization. And yet even this reconstruction remains tentative, because every assumption is layered on interpretations of fossilized impressions that have been altered by time, pressure, and mineralization, leaving us with a creature that is simultaneously present and absent in our understanding between vertebrate, invertebrate, or entirely unique lineage. The Tully Monster becomes less of a solved puzzle and more of a mirror, reflecting the limits of our scientific frameworks, showing us that even with modern tools, deep time still contains forms that resist closure. And as we move closer to understanding its biology, we also move deeper into uncertainty, because every answer seems to open new questions of millions of years. And in that space between knowledge and mystery, the Tully Monster continues to drift through scientific imagination, like it once drifted through ancient seas, unchanged in its strangeness, still refusing to settle into any category we can confidently define. And so we arrive at the final layer of the Tully Monster story, not as a conclusion that ties everything neatly together, but as the moment where the mystery stops being about a single fossil and becomes about the nature of extinction, memory, and how life erases its own experiments. Because the deeper we move into the geological record, the more we realize that the Tully Monster is not just an isolated anomaly from the Carboniferous seas, but possibly one of countless body plans that once existed briefly and then vanished completely, leaving no evolutionary descendants, no transitional forms, and no modern equivalents to anchor our interpretations. And this absence is what makes it so haunting, because extinction is usually understood as disappearance with traceable lineage or replacement. But in cases like Tully Monstrum gregarium, what we are dealing with may be something closer to biological silence, a full erasure of a design that never repeated itself again in Earth's history. And as we reflect on the Mazon Creek fossil beds, we begin to see them not just as a window into ancient life, but as a rare and fragile archive of forms that almost never fossilized, meaning what we call known prehistoric life may be heavily biased toward organisms that happen to fossilize well. While creatures like the Tully Monster represent a hidden majority of evolutionary experimentation that we only glimpse through extraordinary preservation conditions. And this shifts the meaning of its strangeness entirely, because instead of asking why it looks so alien, we begin to ask how many other aliens once existed on Earth that we will never discover at all. And in this sense, the Tully Monster becomes a symbol of invisible biodiversity, a reminder that evolution is not a clean narrative of progress, but a chaotic branching system where most branches end without leaving visible traces, and even within scientific debates about its classification, whether it belongs closer to vertebrates or represents an entirely separate lineage. What becomes more important is not the final label, but the fact that multiple plausible interpretations can coexist from the same fossil evidence, revealing how interpretation itself is shaped by modern biological expectations. And as we consider extinction not as a single event, but as a long process of ecological disappearance, we can imagine the world of the Tully Monster slowly changing as carboniferous ecosystems shifted, oxygen levels retreated, and ecological niches collapsed or transformed, gradually removing the conditions that allowed such a creature to exist, until eventually it was no longer viable, not because it failed in a single moment, but because the world that supported it dissolved over geological time. And in that slow fading, the Tully Monster would have disappeared without drama, without witnesses, and without evolutionary successors, leaving only rare fossil impressions as its final message to the future. And when we look at those fossils today, encased in ironstone nodules, we are not just observing anatomy, but reading the outcome of an ancient biological experiment that ended without continuation, forcing us to confront a deeper truth about evolution, that innovation in nature is not always preserved, not always successful, and not always understandable in hindsight, because life explores possibilities blindly, without guarantee of survival or legacy, and many of those explorations are lost entirely, making the Tully Monster less of a question to be solved and more of a reminder of how much of Earth's biological history is permanently inaccessible. And yet even in this uncertainty, there is a strange kind of meaning, because the persistence of this fossil in scientific discourse shows that human curiosity refuses to let go of unresolved mysteries, continuing to re-examine, reanalyze evidence in search of clarity that may never fully arrive. And perhaps that is the most important aspect of the Tully Monster, not what it definitively was, but what it forces us to accept about science itself, that understanding deep time is not about achieving final answers, but about learning to navigate uncertainty with better tools, sharper questions, and a willingness to accept that some forms of life may never fit neatly into our systems of classification. And as we step back from the ancient seas of Illinois and the strange drifting creature they preserved, we are left with a final image that lingers not as resolution, but as reflection. A soft-bodied organism moving through dark water, eyes scanning a world we can no longer see, probing an environment that no longer exists, and then vanishing completely into extinction's quiet archive, leaving behind only fragments of stone and speculation. The Tully Monster continues to exist, not as a solved mystery, but as a permanent question embedded in the history of life, reminding us that evolution is far more inventive, far more unstable, and far more incomplete than any framework we use to describe it, and that the true story of life on Earth is not what survived, but what was lost without ever being fully understood.